Great. It's we've got an hour with Claude. I mean, what a dream, right? So I'm David Creswell. I'm a professor here at Carnegie Mellon, and like many of you, I was inspired by Claude's work. And I can actually remember being a first-year graduate student and having all those feelings of wondering if I belonged. And reading the Self-Affirmation theory paper, the 1988 paper that many of us have referenced the last 2 days, and just being inspired. And then sort of reading more about Claude and his work, and seeing someone that developed a career on understanding how people sort of cope under threat. I mean, that's kind of what you've done. And just saying, I do belong. This is like what I want to be like him. And many of us have had that experience. And of course, the more you get to know Claude, the more deep you see he is as a thinker and scholar. The way I was thinking about structuring this was I've got some questions to kind of kick this off. This is sort of the behind the artist studio moment where we're going to try to kind of get some of his stories about the genesis and development of self-affirmation theory and research, and then maybe end with some broader reflections on where you see the field going would be great. But to sort of try to keep that within 40 minutes, and then we do have this mic, so using the last 20 minutes or so that we have to open it up for other folks who have questions of Claude. So this is not about me, this is about us getting to really hear some of the stories. But I thought before we do that, since we're really the last session, we should all acknowledge the organizers. So maybe the four of you guys could come up real quick. Or just stand up at least. I was getting to sort of watch them work over the last couple of years. This was a labor of love for the four of them, who really, as sort of junior people, like you were like hustling money at SPSP and creating enthusiasm across the the self-affirmation community to make this happen. And I think this has just been beautifully organized and well thought out. You guys just did a phenomenal job. And I don't know if any of you have done conferences before, but it seems like you're like pros. So we'll look forward to whatever you guys want to do next. I will certainly sign up. Okay, so maybe Claude, to start, a lot of this early work, or where you started with self-affirmation, was really sort of coming out of the early work you did on cognitive dissonance, and sort of challenging these sort of consistency theories about the self. And I'm just curious, as you were starting out that work, do you have any stories or sort of experiences that really sort of drove you to kind of build out this approach?
Yes, I think it starts in a stumbling early career. I had one experiment that worked, and it had in it a clue that ultimately helped think about consistency theories in a different way. And I think I talk about that study in the first part of that chapter, name calling and compliance. And this was in the days when social psychology was ethically irresponsible, ruthless. And so we got into this. I got interested in this question of compliance, what makes people comply. And so we did a study in which we called housewives in Salt Lake City, where I was. It's my first job at the University of Utah. And we wanted to see if name calling would affect, being exposed to a possible negative judgment would affect their compliance with something. So the thing we wanted to comply with was to go through their kitchens and list all the things that were there to help us guide the buying of a food co-op that we were setting up. So that was what they had to say yes or no to. And 2 days before that, they got a call which in the critical conditions called them a name. And the name was, it's pretty much, hello, how are you? It's pretty much common knowledge that women in your community are not very cooperative community projects. And then, invariably the person would say, well, that's not true. And they would start to counter-argue, but the caller would just go on with the script, and then the call would end. And then we would call them back, a different person would call them back 2 days later and see if they would agree to help with this food co-op. And the interesting conditions were that we thought if they were called a name related to the food co-op, they would be more likely to help with the food co-op than if they were called a negative name unrelated to the food co-op. So the negative name that was unrelated to the food co-op is, it's pretty much common knowledge that women in your community are not that good, are not courteous drivers. And what we found is that it didn't make any difference what name you called them. That really increased the compliance with the food co-op, with the willingness to go through their kitchens and list all these things. So that struck me. I mean, there are other findings in that unethical study by modern standards, maybe by any standards. But that stuck. That there, what would helping with a food co-op have to do with reducing the particular inconsistency of being seen as a bad driver? So I tucked that away, and then many years later, I read a book, Mind and Emotion, by George and Jean Mandler, who are two experimental psychologists. That's what they were called in those days. They were kind of cognitive psychologists. And they had a big point. They were summarizing the stress literature and making the point that any kind of response, that, for example, the strongest example was a baby is born, thrown into the world is stressful. The only thing that nature equips them with to calm them down in the face of all this stress is our responses. Bouncing them, doing all the things that babies do, crying, of course, but that the response, interestingly, that helped them calm down, bouncing them up and down, that kind of thing, didn't have to have anything to do with the larger stressor. So that was another clue that in response to a stress, having something to do, even when it isn't directly reducing the stress or reasonably could be assumed to reduce the stress, it can reduce stress. I guess it's, in the standard stress literature, it's like a secondary appraisal, but the implication of their idea was that the response to the stress, the secondary appraisal, doesn't have to be related to the stress itself. That sometimes just doing rote things will help us. Rocking, like in the case of, will help reduce stress. So those things made me, kind of helped me think that that the position of dissonance theory at the time, that the dissonance arose from cognitions that were inconsistent, important cognitions that were inconsistent, and that the effort to resolve that inconsistency was one of the main drivers of mental life. That was what was going on. We couldn't tolerate inconsistency, and when we had an important inconsistency, that pushed us to resolve it some way, to rationalize it away, to change our attitudes. That it was really hard to live with that inconsistency. But in lecturing about this in Intro Social, always been skeptical, because so many people, including myself, who I knew and loved, carried with them and exercised inconsistencies. Smoking. I couldn't get my father to stop smoking cigarettes. He knew full well how bad they were. He knew it put him in danger, but he continued, and he didn't feel bad about it. So, there. How could inconsistency per se be the challenge? So we gradually started doing things to see in a dissonance paradigm if you could reduce dissonance with a response completely unrelated to the provoking cognitions. So you got the inconsistency here. And if you give people a chance to do something that has nothing to do with the inconsistencies, it doesn't resolve them in any way, but it kind of makes a person feel better, would that eliminate the inconsistency? And it kept happening. every time we did it. A standard dissonance paradigm would be you have a group of subjects rate record albums. When in the days of record albums, they would give a rating to each album. Then you'd give them an album, or you'd take an album away. You'd do something to change the album so that let's stick with you give them an album. So you give them a record album, and then when they re-rate the albums, they tend to rate the one you gave them higher. I like this all along. And it's seen in the dissonance that it's resolving that shift in attitude about the record is seen to be restoring consistency. So we would have them do that, but the first study that I think gave us some confidence in something like a self-affirmation was I was doing this research in my alcohol research program. We were giving value scales to introductory psychology classes and then recruiting people for having particular values. So we found people for whom the bench sciences were very important to them. They really wanted to be bench scientists. And early in college life, there's a lot of such people. And so we brought them into the laboratory. They rated the record albums. We gave them the records, and for those who we wanted to affirm, we had them put on a white lab coat, which was to remind them of their chief values, but have nothing to do with the record albums. And sure enough, when they put on the white lab coat, they didn't re-rate, they didn't change their attitudes about the record albums. So it eliminated this rationalization, this need to restore consistency. Consistency is still 100% in place, but this other response would eliminate the need to rationalize and explain away the inconsistency. You could sit with it. So that really, those early findings made us work backwards towards some theory that would draw a picture of psychological functioning that could explain the data. So we were working backwards from the data, which is always a nice place to be, as opposed to having a theory and then trying to get the data. So then the model of the self that what we're doing almost all the time is trying to sustain a perception of ourselves as morally and adaptively adequate. That came from just trying to come up with a picture of the self that would explain these results, starting with the name-calling experiment and the Mandler work, and then we had the data to build a story around. And then once you had the story around, then we could begin to do experiments to test the story independently.
Yeah,
so
let's talk about those early experiments, because you had the 1983 JPSP on sort of self-affirmation and dissonance. And then a couple years later, I think you moved out to attributions, and there may have been some stuff in between. I'm curious, what was the reception like when you were sending out these initial papers? Like, what were reviewers saying when you had this very, challenge to the dominant, dissonance model of the day?
Some of them are good friends, but they really, they just couldn't believe this. They thought it was fiction. And that it just, so some of the reviews I got were really incredibly harsh. And I learned to argue with journal editors in response to that, because we kept getting these effects, so we knew we could get these effects, but they just didn't like the idea, and the consistency story narrative was so normative in the field at the time. There was such a strong consensus around it that the idea that it could be something else, and also the self was not a valued idea in psychology. The self was a suspect idea in psychology, and the idea that it was something that you would work to sustain, a perception of the self that you would work to sustain the self as morally and adaptively adequate just seemed to be a fictional story to the reviewers. So it was a rough go getting those papers in, multiple studies, lots of replications. I mean, in the end and in retrospect, I think it was a good process, but there was nothing like ready acceptance of the idea.
Yeah, and you were certainly, a junior faculty member back in those days.
Yeah.
So that must have been interesting to try to wrestle with the
It was
dominance.
a stressful period.
Yeah, stressful period. When you look at your early work, kind of leading up to the 1988, theory paper, and I'd love to you to tell us about what that was like, really developing that. But before we get to that, were there any people during that time that really sort of, helped grow this or really challenged your thinking in terms of the early self-affirmation work?
Well, when I was sitting here getting ready for this, I want to remember my Washington graduate students, Tom Liu and Lillian Southwick, who were really partners in some of the early work. There were two programs of research. One was on alcohol and one was on what became self-affirmation. And they worked mostly, I couldn't risk them. The alcohol program by that time was on sounder grounds, and they could get work done there. But we kibitzed a lot about self-affirmation, and Tom Liu and I did some of those early studies together. So they were very important people in it. But I was at the University of Washington, and at the time I felt pretty out of the loop. And so I didn't have a lot of colleagueship. And we didn't have, there was one senior social psychologist in the program, Fred Fiedler, who worked on something completely different. So we didn't really talk much about our research. So it was really me and the students that kind of wrestled with this stuff at that point.
So about the theory paper, I mean, as I said, I read it and you created a narrative and a story that just made sense to me. And I sort of had this vision that you sat down and over 2 weeks, it just came out of you. And when I when I asked you about it years ago, you said no, that was a really hard paper to write. I'm just curious if you could tell us what the process was like in terms of developing what was a fairly comprehensive and nuanced, theoretical account that still drives. A lot of us still go back and read that paper today because it still has, nuggets of wisdom in it.
No, I'm really gratified to hear that, and I think it was the hardest, either the hardest or one of the two hardest papers I ever tried to write in my long years in the business, and because you had to, the theory had to be developed in the writing of that paper. And so you had to create a narrative that would hold everything together and navigate between the standing theories that were relevant in the day. And so no, I had a sabbatical. I remember I started working on that paper maybe 12 hours a day on April 1st, and I ended on July 28th. And I didn't do anything, see anybody except my family during that time. I've never done anything like that before or since. I don't recommend it as a way to work. I recommend the opposite of that, a little bit every day. I really think that's a wiser way to do it, but I had a deadline. I had to be on a panel of self-theorists at APA. So I felt I had to get this done. So I just locked myself up and wrote that. But it was hard, and just wending your way through that and to create a narrative was the hard work of it.
I mean, you're really known for kind of big theories, stereotype threat, and they all kind of, they relate. Alcohol, myopia. When you think about, going about developing a theory, can you tell us or provide some ideas on how you approach that and how you think about developing, these theories with layers, you know.
Well, one thing I think I can say with some certainty is I learned to do theory development behind the data rather than in front of the data, and that was a big change. If you try to just sit down and think up a theory, I've never had that work well for me. Even thinking up hypotheses, you know, the experiments that I would do then, and the results seem thin, and the results seem marginal. But if you had an effect, and sometimes it's not your effect, it could be somebody else in the literature has got an effect, then now you're on much more comfortable grounds, and the business of writing a theory is you're just offering a reasonable, balanced account of what is out there, and you're projecting from that what could happen and what would be the most useful way to think about this area and this domain. So I think getting behind some findings is what was a big discovery for me. I did model this a little bit on Stanley Schachter's research. I don't know how current Stanley Schachter is as a figure in the field these days, but I loved his work, and he had a strategy of publishing multiple papers in the same issue of, say, JPSB. And they would tell the whole story, and you would see how he moved from finding to finding, or maybe from question to question, and seeing that gave me, so that's how you do this research. Is you get a finding, and then that's going to, you have a simple question, you try to get some simple data on it, and then you try to, then another question is going to arise. Well, if that is true, then is this true? And then you test that, and you're sort of off then. And you've changed the probability of your outcomes by starting with a finding that's already there. And because if it's already there and it's reliable and replicable and reasonable, then you got a much better chance of the research working out and of the work being meaningful, interpretable. So I would say that when I discovered that in my career in the early 80s, it changed my fate. And I, with students, always, let's just get some data here. We could talk all around this. You do need to read everything relevant, but let's see if we can get some data. And oftentimes the data will say this is a ridiculous idea. It doesn't. There's no connection to reality. But now you know something, and almost any data you start interpreting it, and you can find in it what's reliable and what's interpretable. So that's been the approach.
So, 1988, that was over 30 years ago. And I'm just curious.
I was only 10, 15 years old.
Yeah, that's right. But I mean,
it's amazing.
Yeah. The self-affirmation, paradigm and theory that you developed, has created hundreds of, high-impact publications. And, the work that was described here at this conference and at the conference over, in the UK, two affirmation conferences in 1 year. I mean, this has been a very rich just the growth has been tremendous. And I'm just curious, as you look at that 30 years of research, what are your reactions to that? I'm anticipating you saying you never would have anticipated it sort of taking the twists and turns that it did, but I'd love to hear what you have to say about where things have gone since that theory paper.
I am astonished. There's part of me that just can't believe it, this work is so amazing and informative. I'm a biased perceiver of it, but I just think it's so important. But I have to say that this is important, that I think the credit for the broad dissemination of the idea and the work, it doesn't come from that initial paper, but from students who've worked with me, like some of them in this room, picking up the idea and taking it to some applied area, and in particular, taking up the manipulation itself, and seeing what that manipulation would do in a whole variety of domains. And by the time all of that was going on, I was probably more preoccupied with stereotype threat and developing that work and set those data and theory. And so I would have to credit the flowering of that idea to my students, because they're the ones that really took that. And I can even remember, just to make this point clear, maybe it was talking to Jeff and Julio. I can't remember. Maybe David, but a little skeptical that you could get a self-affirmation that would really. I don't know if you remember this. Be kind now. A little skeptical that self-affirmation was going to improve academic outcomes. The only credit I think I take is that the stereotype threat research shifted our interest, our focus to education. And so there was a lot of that going on in the lab. And a lot of people came to that lab with those interests. So it may have been inevitable that sooner or later people would pick up self-affirmation and apply it to those concerns, achievement gaps, group achievement gaps, that kind of thing, that cohere the focus in the laboratory at the time. But I think the idea that it could have effects, when you're way back there writing it up, you could see implications of the idea, and in a lot of applied settings. You could see implications, and you could fantasize that, I bet if you tested that, you might get something that would really surprise people. And this would take this work a lot farther than where the consistency models in the field would allow us to go. That untethering it from consistency. It's not psychological consistency that people are after. It is a perception of the self as morally and adaptively adequate. That's what you have to maintain. And if you threaten that somehow, you can threaten it in a million ways, whereas consistency can only be threatened in terms of inconsistency. But this image of the self could be threatened in a lot of ways, and it could be restored in a lot of ways. So I felt that absorbing that consistency focus of the field, that was the major focus of social psychology at the time, into this more general model would have applied implications, that you could take them that way, and you, at the level of fantasy and the like, you could imagine experiments that would work. But as I say, myself, I got absorbed in sort of extricating myself from the alcohol research and beginning to get much more involved in the stereotype threat research. And so the self-affirmation research and those implications in my head sort of sat on the shelf for a while until certain people came along and picked up on them. So I want to just be clear about the story of it as I remember it. And as I say, sometimes I was just intuitively skeptical, but deeply gratified. And now I'm, nothing short of a true believer.
Well, I was going to ask you, what were some of the biggest surprises? And certainly the education domain sounds like it was a big surprise for you. But one of the other themes in this conference and that sort of dominates a lot of the literature is around mechanisms of affirmation. And you've sort of heard a lot about the work there. And I'm curious how you think about mechanisms for affirmation effects, and what suggestions you might have about how to move that area forward.
Yeah, I think so that would be a vein of research in self-affirmation work that I think could be very usefully pursued. I guess I'm happy that it isn't the main focus, but that the first focus has been showing that an affirmation or being affirmed can affect a lot of things, and things that we care about. I like the fact that that wound up being the first focus. And as time goes on, I think because you can come up with almost an infinite number of possible mediating mechanisms, and they are probably going to be, some of them at least, quite context specific. It's this mechanism in this context, but a different one in that context. And so before one embarks on all that, it's just nice to have some confirmation that the effect itself or the effects are important, useful effects. Then I think I always think more like an applied person, actually, and I would hold the research on mechanisms to, well, what would be the implications of it being mediated one way or the other? What would be the practical implications? If it was mediated by this, what would that mean compared to if it was mediated by that in a practical way, in relation to some practical effect? Because you could just get lost forever you could strand yourself on a mountain of pursuing a mountain of different mediators and mechanisms, and they become almost words, not real, something that doesn't really correspond to underlying process. So the only way in thinking about it that would tell you which one to look for is where you can imagine it would have a practical implication. I would think about it that way.
So, looking forward, now that you're hearing about all the stuff that's going on, do you think there are areas that have been understudied or sort of ripe for development now for self-affirmation research?
Well, maybe I did before this conference, but I'm just astonished and amazed. Just this morning, these talks that you guys gave were just so interesting, and just the beginnings of real, big-time programs of research, and the results are very encouraging. Let's say that things are likely to pay off. So I am deeply gratified by the range of things to which it has been applied. I like to think that theoretical story has some merit to it, I suppose, in organizing the research. This business, and I wish it were more broadly understood, the basic notion that in human beings, I'm going to put this in an overly general terms, but that in human beings, a lot of the moment-to-moment work we're engaged in, even when we're asleep, is sustaining a perception of the self as morally and adaptively adequate, that we just are very sensitive to violations of that or threats to that. And it's, I used to give these examples. That's why I think I ended that paper with that Gazzaniga research, showing how quickly people make up a rationalization for something that's unexplainable. I can remember just watching a bicycle race near my house in Seattle, and a person gets very seriously injured, but gets up and immediately wants to get back on the bike and wants to help other people. And they can't see what everybody else can see, which is a horrible injury. But the self is right there. I'm okay. It's cool. Everything is fine. I'm ready to go. I think it's just that. It's just the process is just that elemental in the human experience, that we don't like it even for a minute to have things that threaten our perception as morally and adaptively adequate. And we do a lot of work on a daily, moment-to-moment basis to keep that perception going. And I think that's what's at the root of the effect. So when a person is in a threatening situation, that motor is just working through all kinds of ideas and issues to keep this image afoot. And if you do something to relax that, take that little, just take some of the energy out of it, like an affirmation, then I think people are much more open to all kinds of things that, okay, like my father in smoking. I think he thought of himself as a good person in other ways, and he was. And he had a lot of reinforcement for that. So the fact that he smoked in an era when there was no doubt about the damage that would cause, didn't affect his sense of himself, because he had other sources of that. I also think in the area of research there was an implication of the theory that maybe is right for more research, which is that we're only accountable in that perception of the self to the things that we have identified with, that have become incorporated as a self-standard to which we hold ourselves accountable. So I'm not accountable to how good a chess player I am, or how good a tennis player I am. So I could be terrible at it and it wouldn't mean anything. But if you're a tennis player and you have even the slightest trouble, it can be deeply painful, because that is an incorporated, internalized part of the self to which you hold yourself self-evaluatively accountable. So that part of the theory, I think, is important and useful to include too. That and you get other implications, that a person could have a very narrowly predicated self-concept, where really all in their life, the only thing in their life to which they care about and are identified with is tennis playing, and that is going to, really, they're not accountable in any other way. They're not maybe accountable to being nice or civil or smart, or a whole bunch of other things are off the table for them, and it's all on this one area, which is going to make a pretty unstable self, because anything that happens, there's no other resource to affirm this overall perception of the self as competent and good. So if we over-identify with our work, for example, our theories, for example, our kids, for example, if we over-identify with something and to the exclusion of other things, then we become pretty vulnerable and maybe destable. That's an implication that I think is in there. And if you have a more balanced life, where you care about this and you also care about this and you care about that, so when something happens bad here, there's still a lot of you left that can affirm this overall sense of worth. I would say that's how my father got through the smoking threat. That there was a lot of other things that he did that enabled him to not be knocked off balance by that. So that's an implication of the theory that I think can be useful in some cases.
So I want to just take the last couple minutes and maybe broaden out. What are you working on now? I know you're back at Stanford. I think you're in your old office.
Yes, I am.
What are you working on?
Well, when I take my feet off my table in there, what I'm working on now, I think, has been shaped by the experience of being an administrator and being a provost, where you're kind of responsible for all of a sudden you're responsible for integrating a lot of interests in the institution. Before that, you were just pushing your interest. I'm just pushing my interest, but then all of a sudden in a role like that, now you've got to figure out all these interests. So I think the question that sort of came to me, developed over that experience, is, well, how do you have a successfully diverse community? How do you make the whole community work? And then you start thinking about that, and you realize it's a basic American question that we were talking about this yesterday, but as a society, we did decide to have an integrated society, and that most societies throughout the history of our species deal with diversity by one group suppressing the other group. The idea that we're going to get together and have a society where people from very different backgrounds are going to have equal access to all opportunities and to contribute and the like. It's just this, we take it for granted. That's a very good thing, but it's kind of a big deal. And I don't think maybe we've thought enough about how do you actually do that. And so what I've been thinking about is, well, what's so hard about that is the first question. And so whereas I think we've made a really good case for the value of diversity and how we draw on diversity to solve problems and the like, I don't think we appreciate the challenge inherent in it to some degree, which is that diversity is bringing into the same setting, campus setting, school setting, corporation setting, people from groups that have had and continue to have very different experiences in society. And the challenge for the people coming in and sort of pursuing integration into the mainstream of society, the challenge is, can I trust this situation? Given the experience of my group, can I just relax here and engage this for what it is, or does a big part of me have to be allocated to protecting myself and maybe protecting my group and this? I can't just forget this identity because it's so structured into the way our society is organized. In a different society, that same feature might not be a meaningful identity, but in this society, given the history, it is. So it drives me to a sense that a big challenge of having such a community is trust, and that's what's difficult about diversity is trusting ourselves with each other. And it's where our history visits us. I've used the example of a parent-teacher conference in school where parents are black, the teacher is white. They're talking about how their son is doing, and here's where history is just all over the place. The black couple is coming in worried that their child is going to be seen stereotypically, and maybe his abilities won't be appreciated or recognized, and that any transgressions may be really read as tendencies to violence, and they're bound and determined to get this teacher to see things the right way. And the teacher, for her part, is saying, look, anything critical I'd say to be constructive or helpful here is going to be interpreted as I'm a racist. So before they've said anything to each other, in this society, their identities have a lot going on there, and they're in a big part in interacting with each other, negotiating those things. And to have a real communication about the child, there has to be a kind of trust that gets developed. And a lot of our pedagogy, when you think about educational institutions, doesn't appreciate the need to take the time to build that trust in the classroom community or in a school or campus-wide community, and doesn't think about how you go about doing that and what has to happen first and how you address people. And we're struggling with that as a society. What's necessary in order for us to trust each other enough to relate constructively and creatively with each other. So that's the general problem, and I go back over research I've been associated with and research in the field, and I try to point to a variety of strategies that would help build trust. How does an individual behave in order to be trusted in a situation? How should that teacher behave in order to be trusted? How should the parents behave in order to be trusted? And we have a lot to say about that. But I think it's an important problem. I don't know if I'm going to have the time or the time left, I should say, to really mount a research program on that like I would like to do. A big part of me would like to do. I think there's some really researchable ideas there. One is the narratives we evolve for relating to each other, the understandings that we have. I think there's a lot of room for to have constructive effects on shaping the narratives that people have about the situations that we're in, the narratives of the parents and the narratives of the teacher about that situation. So there's some, I think, some enticing areas of research, but it's hard at 73 to just launch a big R01 research program.
You can
so
inspire some collaborators here, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Maybe one last question, and then we'll open it up. In the last 10 years, social psychology has just been going through tremendous change. And, there's a lot more, media exposure, for better and for worse. There's a lot of interest and eyes on social psychology. There's all this interest in terms of how we do the business that we do, pre-registration and replication and these things. From your vantage point, how do you see this change, and what do you recommend to sort of, young social psychologists coming up about, how to approach the work?
Yeah, well, I think I've been coming back into the field. I guess I describe myself as in progress of trying to absorb these developments in the field and what they mean. I think by and large registration is a good thing. Sounds like it can't be too bad a thing. I mean, you could imagine how it could be corrupted too if you really wanted to do that, but nonetheless, I think it's probably a useful thing. I think about how that would have affected me, and if that had been something in my time. Except for this fact that I really do like to get data on something and get it kind of an empirical. And I don't know. I could register that, though, and that might be just fine. But I would hope that wouldn't preclude that pre-testing and messing around and going into files and trying to find the way the phenomenon works in undergraduate courses and the way it works in the hospital. You got to have this time to just be a gumshoe. Well, you don't really know what the thing is. You're trying to get a hold of it, and to register every move could be could be quite something. But anyway, I think in general that's a good thing. Another thought I have is using bigger samples. That's probably a good thing. It used to be just the opposite. I can remember getting papers, being held under suspicion because you had too many in. It means you were trying to produce a significant effect. So you would add subjects, and that would be seen as, well, you don't really have a very strong effect. That was a logic of, I've suffered under that. So, but the other I hope related. I've been on the board of the Russell Sage Foundation for a good number of years, and I've seen I'm going to put this maybe more frankly than I would ever want to be quoted, but I've seen the behavioral economists come in and mow our grass, and they get a lot of the money, the research dollars, and I think the appeal that they have is that they're often doing things in the real world with big samples and really directly policy-related research. They're not theoretical at all in the sense that we are, and that's a huge shortcoming that will befall them, I hope, at some point or another, or force us into collaboration with each other, which I think would probably be the best outcome. But as the new psychology rethinks itself, getting out there and doing these bigger studies as opposed to just doing laboratory studies. Laboratory studies, I think, are indispensable, especially when you're doing theoretical work. But getting out there and taking on these bigger things, I hope that's another very good thing. I mean, I suppose the biggest worry you have is that all the factors that are in play would demoralize people and say, geez, I don't know if I want to go into a field where as soon as I get something, 80 people are going to try to fail to replicate. It's a daunting kind of situation we're in to some degree. So I worry a little bit about that because the field, I've always been excited about this field. It's just a great piece of scientific real estate is one way to think about it. That among the hierarchy of sciences, when you get to our science, social psychology, we're just working on so many of the interesting phenomena and processes of human experience at a level that is broadly communicable to people, and a lot of people can be a part of your problem solving and your intellectual life that moves things forward. And so I think it's an exciting science. It's got a great piece of, as I say, real estate. So I wouldn't want these concerns to just scare people out of it. I also think that when you see the field through the lens of, let's say, replication, you're gonna make it's too easy to make the error, especially in the media and the press. It's too easy to make the error that conditionality is failure. That means the effect doesn't work or it has no merit. So it's a challenge we have to struggle with. But the idea that the effect worked here but didn't work there, that's really interesting to us, because that's telling you something about what the underlying process is. But if you just see it all through the lens of replication, you could say, well, that means these are very unstable, unreliable findings that shouldn't be taken seriously. And when we do it to ourselves, you're kind of killing something really vital and important about what the field is. I don't feel that there's been enough talk about that. There's just been, we're in a moment where there's still kind of just fear or anxiety about replication, and the straightening it out as to when that's a real worry and when it's really interesting is something that's I don't think fully appreciated yet. When I was a young person, this happened in the field of social psychology in the 70s, and it had a lot to do with, we take it for granted now, but it was experimenter bias, that and people weren't using blind conditions. People were doing experiments that weren't even experiments; they were just demonstrations. Famously, Phil Zimbardo's work. But there are a lot of them that the field was in the 60s, just going back that far. When I came into it, there were so few social psychologists that you could have the entire Society of Experimental Social Psychology meetings in Bib Latney's living room. That's how small the field was, and that was just in the late 60s, early 70s. So it's a much different enterprise at this point, but the reason the Society of Experimental Social Psychology was formed was because there was a methodological press that the field should be experimental, and the good guys were experimental social psychologists, and the old guys were, they were Lewinians, and they were doing these field experiments, and they kind of had an applied feel to it. And so the Society of Experimental Social Psychology came into existence to purify the strength of inference that you could make about social psychology. So it was a revolution in its own right. And then there started to be a concern about the particulars of experimenter bias and experimenter blinds, and we got through all that. Then there was a period where you could just do a couple of field experiments and get them in JPSP, and JPSP was packed with like 28, 30 articles an issue, and Tony Greenwald came in and cut that down to 7 articles an issue. That was a revolution, man. People's tenure were on the line. So we've been through these periods before, and I think there's valuable residue to them, and that'll probably be the case here. That we'll be better and stronger, and that we'll kind of mellow out over time. But in the meantime, I just hope people don't give up and think that you can't do this kind of work, because you can do this kind of work. And a lot of the work that has been done, there's a great deal of progress in this science. So that's how I feel about it.
That's great. Well, thank you. We should open it up. I think we have the mic coming around.
Chandralekha Singh from University of Pittsburgh. So one thing that really struck me, Claude, yesterday when we were discussing things was that you said that what was really transformative, truly transformative for you, was the fact that your thesis advisor told you, Claude, you are the real expert in this area who has really most deeply thought about these things. So what are your thoughts about these things? And so you actually, this was so validating to you because you felt like, wow, my thesis advisor, whom I really respect, is asking me and telling me that I'm such an expert. So, I mean, I think that this is, this is something that we should really be doing for all of our students, because we as faculty advisors and mentors, don't do enough such things. And I wonder, what is the best way to actually train the mentors to do this kind of thing, and whether value affirmation exercises themselves could have an impact. So there could be a study in which you could actually give those kinds of, where people would write, and mentors would write their values, and then maybe they'll read a reflection piece by Claude Steele saying how those things have been so transformative in, your own professional career trajectory, and maybe that could have an impact. So what are your thoughts on that? Thanks.
Yeah, yes and yes and yes. I have an article coming out in the Atlantic, which I guess I should plug, because it deals with this trust issue, and I used that example, that personal example, and to illustrate that coming into graduate school, I felt under a lot of the identity pressures that we talk about and know about in the field, and I was kind of in personality lockdown. And but in time, not too long, a year and a half or so, my advisor Tom Ostrom, I just noticed that he really was. He took me seriously. He didn't say all the nice things you just said, but I noticed he took me seriously, and he asked me what I thought about things, and it was just shocking to me that given the worries that I had about belonging and all these things, that he seemed to, so it penetrated that anxiety of mine, and it allowed me to trust him. And once I trusted him, even though there were other things I talked about in this article in the environment that today we would see as violating my sense of safety and all that. I mean, people faculty use the N-word. But this relationship was, I could function, and I really wanted to rise to it. I think that happens for everybody in these things, but it's especially important if you're undergoing these kind of pressures. And I wanted to use it as an example of how trust gets built. That pedagogy, effective pedagogy, depends on there being trust. That once we had the trust, I could really grow. Until I had the trust, I was like in defense mode, basically, all the time. That little operator trying to maintain an image of competence and moral adequacy, that was carrying me in this other direction. But then when I could have this relationship with him, I could, it's like, this is my field. I can do this. He thinks so and an implication of that is important, which is that I wanted to underline in that piece, is that everybody can do that. Everybody can do that. You don't have to be of the same ethnicity or gender or what of the student. If you realize the issue is trust, we know how to build that. We can begin to build that, and that's a broadly useful idea for bringing together a diverse community, is understanding that a lot of it has to do with trust, and that if you focus on that, we can improve our communities in that way. So that's what I was trying to use that as an example
of. Maybe I'll ask a question. So I'm curious, for those of us who are privileged enough to be in this room and have the insights that we have from the literature that we're exposed to, and given the beneficial effects of affirmations, I wonder if there's any thoughts about how one might try to self-manipulate and try to self-induce the beneficial effects of self-affirmation, or even to be less likely to doubt the sort of contextual factors that might sort of corrode the sense of trust that you might have. Are there any thoughts that you might have to the individual in terms of the insights that would be relevant?
That's a great question, and I have only the, beginning inklings of how to think about that. But I do think, I think of it as, I could say this is the challenge of the minority parent, the parent of a minority student, or the parent of a woman in STEM, for example, or a woman that wants to rise in the corporate world. What does the parent do to help them not be overly suppressed by the anxiety about being stereotyped and limited and affected and trust? I think there are some things to do. I think about my father. I think he was a good man, black people talk about race all the time. You just do, because you just got to figure it out, and everything is laden with that, and so you spend a lot of time. So he was an artist at that, and I think I would call it maybe tending to our narratives about the situation that we're in. That I could have a narrative. He could give me a narrative that would be supercilious, false conscious, like, Claude, don't worry about, there's no racism, there's no prejudice, everything is cool, we're in a post-racial world, forget about it, just relax, come in, the water's fine. He could give me that narrative, or he could give me the narrative, man, you have to constantly be worried about this. At every turn, you could face this discrimination. I'm working on that narrative, in part through the processes that we were just describing about self-affirmation and maintaining this image of oneself. You're always working on that narrative, your understanding of where you are and what you're going to have to contend with, and so on. I think there is an opportunity there to have, I don't know if completely solve the challenge, but I think they open us up to they help things. A narrative that acknowledges the stress, doesn't do the colorblind thing of, oh, don't worry, I don't know what you're worried about, everything, we all see you as individuals. Nobody's going to buy that who's actually in that situation. And the statement of that makes you not trust the person who just told you that, because they couldn't possibly see what your life is if they would say something like that. So you have to acknowledge there could be some pressures here that you have to deal with. But then there also has to be some hope. There has to be real hope that even though this institution, let's say, you could feel this way and it has these pressures, there are some amazing opportunities here. And you could learn some things that would transform your whole life. I don't think we do a good job with that second part of the narrative. I think our politics are focused on the first part and not enough on the second part. But I do think you could start to do research that would modify these narratives. And you could see some effects of the sort that have been talked about over the last couple of days, that you could give people in an experiment probably some dark narratives and some positive narratives and some balanced narratives. But these narratives are very important. I mean, I think that Obama's political success fed on a recipe for narratives that he evolved, right, in those early speeches of, yes, things are difficult here in this country, there's a real challenge, but there is hope. And, you can be the change you want to be. And people want that. They want a narrative like that. It empowers them. So I'm talking at a very abstract level, but I could imagine it coming down into experiments and research where you vary the narrative that you give people, and you see how they react to it. I think right now, for example, a lot of our political instability is because we're kind of torn between two negatives of the country. Either the country is tremendously wonderful, and it's the greatest achievement of all time. And any demurring from that position is treason. It's one image. Or this is a completely exploitative country that is full of genocide and slavery in its history and full of privilege in its. So but if those are two narratives that are out there that trouble us, and I think are really in our psychological day-to-day functioning. And another narrative might be, well, look, America's got good things and bad things, and it's to be achieved. It's not. We don't think of ourselves as good Americans because we identify with one or the other of those narratives. We think of ourselves as good Americans because we identify with improving the society, with meeting its challenges. That's the thing that is good about America, is that it has a challenge and it meets it. It tries to meet the challenge. And so I think work like at that level can be a bit like a self-affirmation, in that it can affect a variety of outcomes. Because a variety of outcomes and experiences are rooted in those basic narratives and the understandings that we have about things.
Sort of related to that, picking up on it. One of the things that constantly surprises me when I work on self-affirmation is why is there scope for it to work? Given all the kind of benefits that we're talking about here, why is it that people don't naturally do this? Why do not more people more of the time naturally self-affirm?
Well, that's a really good question, and pushes for. I do think that the basic process of maintaining this image of ourselves as morally and adaptively adequate, I hate that long term, but I don't want to drift in. We talked about the dangers of seeing it as self-esteem. It's not self-esteem. It's something else. But that is a fundamentally, evolutionarily selected regulatory process of human behavior that we want to regulate to that image, to what we think a good image is. That's why these narratives are important. We want to regulate to. They have this regulatory. So I think that's that. So self-affirmation comes in, and it maybe has effects in those circumstances where I wouldn't want to say where we're over-regulating, but where we need some help in reminding us that this of getting some perspective on things. I mean, that's one of the mechanisms that I see people listing, but I think it is basically a regulatory process. That's why, and we're kind of working to regulate all the time, and it's probably quite possible to get a sort of focalism on a problem that we're regulating to solve or to rise to or to cope with in some way or another. We're kind of, and an affirmation comes along and kind of relaxes that a little bit, and enables us to take in some more information and maybe make a more rational coping strategy. But I think it's something that is affecting, its impact is through its effect on that basic regulatory process.
So should we do one last question?
Yeah, thank you for all of your stories today. I was wondering if you have any advice you'd like to give to a young researcher that would have helped yourself?
Well, all the advice I could give, I would give it with full conviction, even though I haven't followed it, much of it. I think that's the funny thing about advice. You know what people should do, but well, I think a balanced life is a big deal. I know that can sound irrelevant, but I think it helps you. Because for one thing, a lot of thinking happens away from the task. You work on something, and then you go take a shower, and that's when you actually have the idea that you've been struggling to get for an hour and a half at your desk. So I think working consistently on things is better than binging on things. Doing what I did to write that paper, that would be a binge. I probably could have done it a lot. Maybe could have done it a lot easier if this theory is correct. If I'd been more consistent and worked in a more mediated way, which I normally do. I'm normally pretty give a problem like a writing task, writing a paper, give that like 2 hours a day, and then go pick up your dry cleaning, so that those things don't pile up and drive you into a binge. So I think balance and having some sense of balance is a good friend in over the long haul in our careers. And you don't want to be over. At least the struggle for me is being over involved and maybe over attached to things. That you're after for a while the idea is just fun because you kind of half believe it, but then after a while the idea gets attached to you. And you got to have some balance there, something to balance yourself out at that point, or you'll just tunnel in too much. I guess I'm giving kind of psychological advice here about how to deal with things.
I have that picture of global self-integrity and all the features of the self. You're like, make sure you cover the whole squid, as Dave Sherman would say.
Yeah. That's have multiple legs there. Things that you can do that you care about doing that don't have much to do with the work, and I think it'll help the work over the long run.
Well, we should wrap up. It's noon. I know you guys want to have some closing words. Very little. Okay. Thanks a lot, Claude.
Oh, thank you guys.